Mehret, thank you so much for joining us today on The Voice of America.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so what kind of reporting do you do?
I would say that over the past 2 years and a half, my work has primarily focused on the humanitarian situation in the region, access to humanitarian assistance, and human rights conditions overall in Tigray.
Now, during the war, there was a blockade on the region. Funds were cut. How was it to cover the war in Tigray during the conflict? What was life like in Mekelle, for example?
I honestly, it would be very difficult for me to even explain because I think people have a lot of difficulty even trying to comprehend a world where you don't have phones. One of the things that happened to me, and I talk about this a lot because I think it's really important, is that there was a woman walking. It was midnight, and this woman gave birth to a child on our doorsteps because it was, I think, maybe 200 feet to the hospital. Near my house, but she couldn't walk anymore. She was in labor. She didn't have a phone, so she couldn't call someone to take her to the hospital. We didn't have fuel, so we couldn't drive her there. Even if we could call someone, who are you gonna call? Because no one has fuel. So she literally could not make her way to the hospital, and we had to witness that in the freezing cold. A woman gave birth to her first child, and the implications of not having a phone, the implications of not having fuel for civilians, electricity, and then banking services as well, because banking services were shut and people could not access their savings. I think the implications of that on the civilian population were severe. And me as a journalist trying to communicate to the world the situation and the circumstances, because it was so difficult for people to confirm even the most basic things. There would be thousands of witnesses to an airstrike in Mekelle, but a journalist would find it so difficult to confirm because it was so difficult to get access to internet, to access people inside Mekelle. You'd be able to, maybe it would be government media outlets that would report on it, or it would be this one person, this one source that you had, and then people would not be able to communicate and publish stories, and somebody that was working from inside and trying to get information out. It was very difficult.
How were you collecting reports? Would you have to go to these areas where the fighting was taking place?
I think, again, travel was very difficult. Sometimes we'd have to walk for an hour and a half to speak to a person because, well, firstly, even if there were transportation, the amount you'd have to pay because they would buy it at incredible price. I remember at some point, it had reached like $60 per liter of fuel, and so so they'd collect as much money as they had, but the amount you would have to pay to get transportation would be so expensive. People couldn't afford it. There would be times where there was no way I could afford it as well. So my best option would be, if I really believed in a story and I really had to have it, then I'd have to walk an hour and a half.
Other means of transportation.
Yeah, and then sometimes you go somewhere and then they'll tell you you'd walk an hour or whatever to get there, and people will tell you, he's not here, and then, or she's not here, and then you can't call that person to ask where they are, to inquire where they are. So then I have to go back and then come back again the next day.
How were you communicating with the outside world?
So there were specific agencies that still had access to internet, that had satellite connection, and through a lot of begging and pleading, you would be able to
use their facilities.
To use their facilities for some people would be like, okay, I can help you for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or you'd have other people that have consistent access, and you'd give them your stories, and they'd send it to your producer, to whoever your contact is. And so people had to be very creative in that, and just find a way to get the stories out.
So that's how you would communicate with producers and other journalists from the different agencies you are reporting for.
Yeah, and I know that there were a few that tried to smuggle their stories out.
Yeah.
So you'd have to use whatever creative means.
Were you in any kind of danger? Was as a reporter reporting during this time of conflict?
I think within the region, I don't think there was. I think at the time the institutions in place believed that there was a need to get stories out there as much as possible, and so there weren't that many hindrances present. But it was very difficult to be in Mekelle in and of itself. I mean, it was very difficult to access humanitarian assistance. I've never received humanitarian assistance. I lived there for 16 months. No aid, no assistance. I mean, people don't have access to banking services. No one is better off. If you don't have banking services, if you don't have a salary, if you don't have phones, if you don't have any way of, like, no one is better off. And aid should have been available to as many people as possible, but it wasn't available. And
what aspects of the story did we as international media get wrong, given that we didn't have access to Mekelle because of the blockade and all other restrictions present due to the conflict?
I think people miss the extent of the suffering, and I think the one of the stories that have been most missed is the situation of women and girls in these types of situations. I think we have not gotten sufficient coverage on what happens to women and what happens to girls when you don't have basic services, when you don't have health facilities, what happens to women when they don't have health professionals to look after them, when they're in labor, when they're and also what they can do. Also, you're limited. Your rights over your reproductive rights are significantly reduced in these types of circumstances and in these types of situations. I think the IDP crisis in Tigray, that has resulted due to the ethnic cleansing campaign in Western Tigray, that has resulted in hundreds and thousands of people being homeless and living in repurposed facilities across the state. I think their stories have been missed. I think hundreds of thousands of people living in repurposed schools and health facilities first of all, these institutions can no longer function, can no longer provide service for civilians because they are housing IDPs, and those IDPs are not able to access aid, and their stories are being missed. I think there's been a lot of politics around a lot of these issues, and very little understanding or empathy towards the people that are suffering the most, towards the civilians, the women, the children.
When you say there's a lot of politics, what do you mean?
I mean, I think when we discuss the way issues of Western Tigray are discussed, or the way it misses the human component. It misses the fact that there are people that have been displaced from those areas that need a home, that need to farm, that need to make a living. I think, I think we've missed those stories, and I think it's about it's about egos and who has land and who has and whatever. But I think we miss that this is a humanitarian crisis, and
it's affecting human beings.
That it's affecting human beings. And
how is the situation like right now in Tigray, or specifically in Mekelle, since the peace agreement? Are kids going back to school? Are hospitals functional? I guess the state of infrastructure, rebuilding the whole, the road networks and all that. How are things going?
I think one thing that I want to mention here when we discuss stories is that even throughout the 16 months, even when we had very little medical supplies, even when doctors and health professionals, they weren't getting paid, they were still going to work. They were still going to work, and they were providing the services that they had available to them with the knowledge that they had to them. They were trying to make it work. Whatever they had, they were trying to make it work for their patients. And I think the same is true with teachers and all professions in Tigray. People try to serve when they can, but I think it's still very difficult. People expect to have their salaries for over the past 16 years of the conflict, of 16 months before the peace agreement. That hasn't been delivered on. We don't have the overall restoration or normalization of relations. There is still some hindrance in terms of transportation. It hasn't been easy for Tigrayans to access transportation in and out of Tigray, specifically the crisis with Ethiopian Airlines.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that. What do you make of that story that Ethiopian Airlines has not been facilitating transportation for people in Tigray coming to other parts of the...
Yeah, so I was turned back when I tried to in late January when I tried to travel to Addis Ababa. I was turned back by I was informed of the restrictions by an Ethiopian Airlines employee. I asked the Ethiopian Airlines employee who put those restrictions in place. He said he just had a piece of paper from government.
What kind of restrictions?
Restrictions that said that people between the ages of 16 and 65 would not be able to travel outside of, would not be able to use Ethiopian Airlines services to leave Tigray. And so he said that there were these restrictions in place, and that people would not be able to board unless, if you were within that age range, you would have to have a particular reason why you're traveling. either you have a health condition or you are accompanying a minor or someone suffering from an illness or an elderly. So unless you have unless you qualify, you would not be able to travel.
So
and also, I think another part of that is that when you travel from Addis Ababa to Mekelle, your luggage doesn't arrive with you. Sometimes I lost my luggage, but sometimes people have to wait 4 or 5 days before their luggage arrives. Sometimes it's just a day, and sometimes it's 4 days. And through that logistical, and this is a 45-minute flight.
Yeah.
And because of this logistical issue, people are also more likely to lose their luggage.
So you're here. How did you make it?
I had a health condition. I do suffer from a degenerative eye condition, and so I had to see my doctor in Addis Ababa, and I was able to provide that proof, and I got to see my doctor.
So you took the proof to the airline and said this is.
Yeah.
You're required to provide that before you're booked onto a flight.
Yes.
What kind of impact has that had on people in the region? The fact that they're not able to travel freely in and out.
And it's not even that people are not even.
Also,
it's
we have
also
to
because
mention
it's extremely expensive to travel.
Right.
And so people here some people suffer from health conditions. Some people haven't seen family members in years and are desperate to see their family members, you know. When people travel outside, I mean, the person I was traveling with the day I was turned back, he hadn't seen his 2 children in 2 years. And so he was really quite desperate to get to Addis and be with his family. And so these are the type of stories you hear when people
Now,
are being
Ethiopian
turned back.
Airlines obviously has denied this reporting about them not letting people from Tigray travel to Addis Ababa.
Yeah.
What do you make of that denial?
I think there is ample evidence. I think there are multiple stories. I think there's ample evidence to indicate that. I think
Now, both WFP and USAID recently suspended food distributions in Tigray after it was revealed that the food aid was being stolen or being sold on the open market. How does this decision impact the people in the region?
I think again I'm going to go back to the stories of IDPs and people that are. I think money that is coming to support the most vulnerable people should go to them, and I think there has to be serious mechanisms in place to ensure that happens. And I think it's the corruption of the conflict and the siege that has made it. That may have made it difficult to monitor, but I think monitoring is very essential to ensure that people receive the aid that they need. But I think that obviously we have malnutrition rates going up. We have children dying because of this. And so I think this is something that has to be done concurrently, where you have these monitoring mechanisms, where you put these monitoring mechanisms in place, but you try to do as much as humanely possible to ensure that the most needy get the aid that they deserve as well.
How were people receiving news about the war inside Mekelle?
So we would also have power blackouts, and that would last weeks and sometimes months, and so that would make it difficult to get information. But I think there was this interesting thing where people that had access to internet services would kind of go into the building and take screenshots of social media. Of social media interactions and stories, important stories that have been published about Tigray, and they would go out and they would distribute it. There would be like these areas where people could go to get screenshots of. So it had gotten to a point where me and my friends would be like, have you seen Facebook today? And then people, instead of saying Facebook, would start saying screenshots, because
they called it screenshots.
Yeah, so everybody's like, okay, did you get screenshots? And so then people would look, would see these and get some people that would have access would download news stories and would bring them over, and then friends, would come together and see just to learn about the situation. And I think people were very desperate because of the humanitarian situation. There was a lot of hope and anxiety around political progress. People would want to know as soon as it happened, but that was obviously very difficult.
What was the state of, or what is the state of media freedom in that part of the country ever since the war ended? Are you able to report freely? Are you able to move and access people that you want to report on and send your reports without them being censored?
I think there's still a little bit of the international media still don't have access within Tigray. We don't have media organizations that are officially accredited by the Ethiopian government coming into the region to report on the situation. And I think that's still a very big issue.
So there has not been any major media institution
international institutions.
Yeah.
No, we haven't had international media groups come into Tigray to report.
What about local reporters?
Local reporters have continued. I understand that it's still very expensive, or it's still very difficult to access fuel. It's not very easily available. People have to wait in line 2-3 hours. It's still telecom services are sometimes tricky. So yeah, there's internet connection is very slow as well. So there is a lot of difficulties around that, but things are relatively better. But the humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian situation, even the withdrawal on caches, all of that restrictions affect the journalists living within those states, and living within the state, and impact how they're able to function and do their work.
Do these restrictions still exist?
Yes, banking restrictions specifically have been a major hurdle.
But the phone lines have been open. You can make phone calls back and forth.
Yeah.
What aspect of the story do you think that has not been reported upon by the fact that there's no international media presence in this region?
I think one of the main things that we don't have because of that is that major platforms are not able to come in and kind of witness the situation on the ground. So it's the availability of that platform, I think, that's mainly affected when these major when these major medias that communicate in multiple languages, and can speak to different parts of the world, are not available to come inside and report on the news. I think that impacts it. That impacts the lack of the platform. That impacts it, and I also think that. That experience as well, because when you have journalists with that experience, experience reporting on conflict areas, with knowledge of how to monitor humanitarian situation, knowledge of how to monitor human rights, and I think when you have that gap in knowledge, because people that have worked there, this is. Conflict reporting is not really an experience, because, conflict is relatively new. So that experience also lacks.
And what is your assessment on how international media covered the conflict, or still covers this conflict? What are some of the things that we get wrong?
I think I see a lot of both sides, and this doesn't happen everywhere, but there is a lot of both sides kind of narrative that plays into that, even in situations of even in humanitarian situations sometimes, and I see that, yeah, and I also sense that at times. I understand for international media organizations that they have to kind of, work with other bodies, they have to work with the government, that they have to kind of negotiate their relationships. And so I think that affects how they're able to do reports, and I also think that there weren't as many stories coming out of Tigray. I think people kind of grew tired after a certain time, because it was so difficult to get stories out there. And so I think there could have been more done in terms of bringing to light the severity of the situation in the region, the severity of the situation in Tigray. I think now even airstrikes and the severity and the attack and how much, it's so, I understand how difficult it is to track, but I think there's so much technology in the world that can help you do that, and I think they've perhaps failed to take advantage of those technological advancements to properly report.
Are you still reporting?
Yes.
What are you reporting on currently?
So what I'm interested in right now is migration out of Tigray, people brain drain, people that want to leave the region as a result of the conflict, and how disempowering, especially the siege feels when people, can't leave a certain area, their mobility is significantly hampered. Their access to basic services is hampered, and people want to take back control over their lives. Young people want to take back that control over their lives and kind of feel devastated and exhausted, and so I'm wondering how that's going to impact Tigray over a span of time. Yeah.